every morning when they woke up, the princess's dancing slippers were worn through, tattered to shreds. And as time went on, those princesses started wasting away, getting thinner and thinner and thinner. Well, the king started locking them in their bedroom at night to make sure that they weren't doing crazy, ridiculous girl things. But still, every morning they woke up and their slippers were worn through with holes. And the king's budget for dancing slippers was just not that big. So he sent out a decree across all of the lands that any man who could solve the mystery of what was happening to the princesses and cure them of this wasting sickness that they had, that man would get to choose any of the 12 princesses to marry. And he had 3 nights to do so, and if he couldn't do it on the after the third night, he would be put to death. Well, Marge was sitting outside her cottage that she lived in with William, where she had moved after she moved out of the castle. Marge used to live in the castle, and she lived here in this cottage now, close enough to hear the castle chimes at midnight and morning and evening. And she lived here comfortably with William. When she heard this news about the princesses being sick and about this challenge to the world to solve their sickness and cure them, well, Marge fell to her knees and cried. Marge loved these princesses not as a royal subject loves their royalty, but as a mother loves their children, because Marge had been their nursemaid and their nanny for all 12 girls, until the oldest, January, had gone to her father and said, "Father, we are much too old for a nanny. Send her away." Well, Marge had left the younger girls crying, the older girls looking at her with cold stares. She had gone down the road, found this cottage, and moved in with William, her bosom companion, and now she lay there in the dirt crying with William next to her. It began, the first one they saw walking down that road to the castle was a prince with umber skin. And he had a black stallion that he rode and a whole retinue of physicians and magicians and scientists and scholars behind him. And as he passed, Marge called out, "You going to try to save the princesses? I know him pretty well. I could give you some advice." And the prince stopped his horse and he said, "Ha, ha, 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 ha. I have a whole kingdom's worth of scholarship behind me. What need do I have of a cottage woman's advice?" And he kicked his horse and spurred off towards the castle. Well, 3 days later, Marge and William watched as that retinue came marching back down the road, and that black stallion behind them dragging a golden coffin. Next was a knight with grass-green eyes, wearing shining silver armor, and he rode a white steed, and he was followed by a page. And they went down the road past Marge's cottage, and Marge called out, "You going to save the princesses? Let me know if you need any advice. I know those girls pretty well." And the knight said, reared back his horse, and he said, "Ha, ha, 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 ha. I am the strongest and the bravest. I have battled demons and dragons. What need do I have of a cottage woman's advice?" And he spurred his horse on and he rode off towards the castle. And 3 days later, his page rode back with that white steed behind him, carting just a pile of silver armor. Well, finally, a farm boy came by with hair the color of straw, riding a mule, and he clomped on past, and Marge said, "You going to try to save the princesses? I could give you some advice. I know him pretty well." And the young boy, he stopped and he said, "Well, I am the most intelligent one in my village for generations. I'm the smartest one we've seen in a long time. I am sure that I can solve this mystery. What need do I have of a cottage woman's advice?" And he kicked his mule back in, and he kicked it again, and he kicked it again, because it's a mule and it just didn't want to go, and he finally got the mule going, and off he went down the road to the castle. Marge looked at William and said, "Oh, that's a real shame." And William looked up at Marge and said, "Meh," because William was a goat. Well, a few days later, that mule came back with an empty saddle. Marge looked at William and said, "William, I guess some things we just got to do ourselves, whether they want me there or not." And she went into her cottage and she got a big old bag, and she filled that bag with some of these and some of those, and she filled it with like she got some spoons and some a roll of twine and a sponge and an old tattered piece of fabric that had been in her family for generations. She shoved it all into this bag. She tied a rope around William's neck, and she went off down the road to the castle. Well, that night, first I should tell you, all of these 12 princesses, they share a bedroom. It's kind of like a dormitory. So it's like made of stone, right? It's in the castle. It's made of stone. Long room. There's 6 beds down each side. There's windows carved in the side of it. There's tapestries hung on the walls and rugs, deep rugs laid out on the floor. And off to one side, right as you enter the big door, there's like a little nook with like a cot and a couple of shelves. And that is the nanny's nook. Now, Marge is very familiar with the nanny's nook, having lived there for so very long herself. And that night, the girls went into bed, and Marge followed them in, and they closed those doors and locked them behind. Marge got settled into the nanny nook. She pulled out all her stuff and kind of put everything back where it used to live in all those accustomed grooves. And she set up a pile of straw and alfalfa for William that had been set up ahead of time, which was very nice and very welcoming. So William was over there on a straw, and she was here on her cot, and she was going to stay up all night to watch these girls and figure out what was happening to their dancing slippers. But January, the oldest daughter, the oldest princess, came around the corner to the nook, and she was holding a goblet of wine. And January, her arms were so thin that her muscles trembled just to hold this goblet of wine. Her hair was lanky and thin. It was falling out in patches. She had dark, dark blue circles under her eyes. And she held this goblet out and said, "Miss Margaret, thank you so much for trying to save us. It has been very nice to meet you. I've brought you a goblet of wine." Well, Marge said, "January, it's me, Marge. You don't recognize me?" But January just turned and went back to her bed without a word. Well, Marge took a sip of that wine, and she said, "Huh." Well, she sat there on her cot, kind of sitting close to the corner of the nook where she could kind of see out. She knew she would be able to hear if any rustling started happening, and she sipped that wine, and she listened, and she sipped that wine, and she listened, and she sipped that wine, and she listened, and then she woke up when the sun was bright in her eyes. Weird, she thought. I didn't know I'd become that much of a lightweight in my old age. Well, all of the girls got dressed. The servants came in to get them all ready. The girls got dressed for breakfast, and they all trooped out to the breakfast hall. And they sat at this long table. The king sat at the head, the six princesses on each side, and Marge sat at the foot as a guest of honor for being the one trying to solve this problem. And the king called across the table, "Miss Margaret, do you have a solution for me yet?" And Marge said, I'm afraid I don't, Your Majesty. You see, that travel day must have taken it out of me. I fell fast asleep last night." And the king said, "Yeah, as I expected. It's what happens to everyone who comes to try. I shouldn't have expected any more out of a cottage woman. Well, eat your breakfast. You've got 2 mornings left to live." And Marge ate her breakfast, but as she ate her breakfast, she noticed that all of the princesses were sitting in front of empty plates. Now, the table was piled full of bowls of fruit and, piles of flapjacks and plates of bacon and jugs of orange juice and mimosas. But the girls just sat there in front of these empty plates, not talking, not gossiping, not whispering, just barely taking sips of water. And Marge thought, Well, that night, they locked them all into that bedroom again. And Marge got herself ready for bed. She got William laying down. January came in again with that goblet of wine. "Miss Margaret, I hope you have a good night's sleep tonight." And Margaret took that goblet and said, "But January, can you just..." But January had already turned and gone. And so Marge, she set that goblet down, and she stood at the corner out of the nook listening to see if she could hear if the girls were getting into bed. And very shortly, it was silent in that room. She peeked around the corner. They were all just under the covers. They were perfectly still. The only sound was the sound of light breathing. Well, Marge turned back to that goblet of wine, but William had gotten to it first, and William was laid out in his hay. Sorry, it's over here. Laid out in his straw. And Marge, this time, she looked at that goblet and she recognized the oily sheen of a sleeping potion. Now, you're not a nanny for a whole bunch of girls for very long without recognizing the oily sheen of a sleeping potion. And she thought, Well, she hadn't drank that potion, so she sat up and she listened. She listened and she listened, and the clock in the tower chimed midnight. And she heard from inside the bedroom a rustling, the shh of bedclothes being pulled back. And she looked around the corner and she saw all of the princesses had gotten out of bed. They were helping each other into these beautiful ball gowns, and they stepped very daintily into their brand new dancing slippers. And remember there's windows cut into the walls, right? So there's moonlight pouring through the window and it's shining on the opposite wall. And as the moon moves across the sky, that patch of moonlight moves and it lands right on January's bed. And as it does, the bed sinks into the ground, revealing a staircase. Well, the girls trooped down that staircase. January 1st, then February, March, April, May, the twins, June and July, August, all the way down to the youngest, December, who, of all of them, seemed to still have the most color in her cheeks. Well, Marge acted quick. She reached into her bag of tricks, remember that big bag she brought? And she pulled out that old tattered piece of fabric that had been her family for generations. And she swooped it around herself and Marge disappeared. There's a reason that tattered fabric had been in her family for so long. Well, Marge followed close behind December down that dark staircase. And when it finally flattened out, Marge was almost blinded by the light because they had stepped into a forest that was not made of wood and trees and dirt. It was a forest of silver. The tree trunks were silver and the branches were silver and the delicate flowers hanging off of the branches was silver. And as they walked through this silver forest, eventually it gave way to a forest all of gold. There were gold branches and there were gold leaves littering the ground and there was heavy gold fruit hanging on those gold branches. And that gold forest eventually gave way to a forest all of diamonds that tinkled as they passed through. Well, they got through that forest of diamonds and they came to a water line. It was a body of water larger than anything Marge had ever seen. It was too big to even see the opposite side. And the princesses stepped up in their dancing slippers, just touched the edge of the water there. And this water was perfectly still. And because they were underground, there was no stars in the sky, so nothing to reflect on it, and it was perfectly black as a mirror. But as the girls' toes touched it, the water at their feet began to ripple and roil and splash, and up came 12 small boats, one for each girl. They lifted up their ball gowns and they stepped very carefully into these boats. Marge clambered in behind December before she was left behind, and those boats took off, smooth and silent across the water. They traveled a long time, and Marge watched across to see if she could see where they were going, and finally, in the distance, she could see some twinkling, like if stars could dance, is kind of what she was seeing over here. And as they got closer and closer, she saw that all those lights were lanterns. And there was a party. She could hear the first strains of music coming across that water, and she could see people dancing, and she could see people feasting, and she could see people walking around with trays of beverages. Well, those boats landed very gently at the other edge of the water, and in front of each boat stood a handsome prince. Well, I mean, it's hard to tell, but they each had a little circlet on their forehead, so we're pretty sure. And they stood there, and they were very regal. And Marge thought they were just a little thinner and paler than she really liked her princes to be, but they were very, very polite as they helped each princess up out of her boat and led her into the dancing. Well, Marge followed behind into the ballroom, and she stood against a wall and hoped no one bumped her. And she watched as the princesses danced. It was a swirling dance with partners turning around each other, and those pairs of partners turning around each other, and all of them all turning around and around like a gyroscope. And as she watched, she realized that she recognized some of the other dancers at this ball. There was a prince with umber skin, and there was a tall, strong man with grass-green eyes, and a young boy with hair the color of straw, all dancing and twirling. Well, they danced until sweat was dripping down their faces. I can relate. Sweat was dripping down their faces, and their shoes were starting to fall apart. There were holes in the toes. She could see through their slippers that they had blisters and their feet were bleeding. And they danced, and finally they stopped. The music stopped. It turned from dancing music into eating music, and all those princesses were led over to long banquet tables that were piled high with golden apricots and ruby pomegranates and ewers of champagne that shone like moonlight. The girls all sat down all in a row, and they grabbed after those apricots and those pomegranates and that champagne, and they were guzzling it down. There was apricot juice dripping down their chin, and their gowns were getting stained with that red pomegranate, and they were guzzling back that beautiful moonlight champagne, just the way that she knew that they could eat. And finally, in the distance, that clock chimed morning. And December, the youngest princess, she heard that chime and she nudged November, and they got up together, and together they rallied all the rest of their sisters, and they had to kind of tug at January's arm to get her to go. She didn't want to leave. They finally got her up out of her chair, and they corralled her over. They got back into those boats, back across the water, through those forests of diamond and gold and silver, and up that staircase where Marge watched them undress back down to their shifts, take off those tattered dancing slippers, put them under their beds, and climb under the bedclothes and fall fast asleep, and asleep like death. They were silent, they were still. It was just the sound of breathing in the room. And Marge thought, Well, the servants came in the next morning at a decent time to wake up as a royal, which was 10, 11 a.m. Got all the girls up, they got dressed, and Marge followed them out to breakfast. Well, they sat at the breakfast table, the king, the princesses, Marge, food piled high on the table. And Marge watched again as the princesses sat quiet in front of empty plates. Now, she knew how much bacon these girls could eat, and they had proved last night that they could still eat that much food. They hadn't changed. Well, the king asked, "Miss Margaret, do you have any solutions for us?" And Marge said, "Not yet, Your Majesty." And he said, "Just as I thought. Well, you've got one breakfast left. I hope you enjoy this one." Now that night, they filed into their bedroom. Marge followed in, and they locked them into that bedroom. January came in with the wine goblet. "Miss Margaret, thank you so much. I really hope it works out for you this time. We will miss you." She handed over the goblet, and Marge took it, and she put it up on a high shelf this time where William couldn't reach it. And January turned and went back to bed. The clock chimed midnight, the moonlight, the patch of moonlight. The girls got dressed. They put on those slippers. January's bed dropped into the ground. And this time, Marge wrapped herself in that fabric, but she also grabbed that big bag of tricks that she had brought, her spoons and her twine and her sponges. And she followed the girls down, and they went down through those forests of silver and gold and the twinkling diamond. But this time, as they walked through the forest of silver, Marge reached up and snapped off a silver blossom. And they went through the forest of gold, and she reached down and scooped up some golden leaves. They went through that forest of diamond, and she tinked off a branch of diamonds, and December turned. And then November said, "December, keep up." And she turned back, and went on her way. Now they went to the water, the boats came up, the boats is right across the lake, the princes, come in, the dancing, everything happened. And then they were led over to the banquet table where they sat down. But this time, Marge sat close behind December, the youngest. And every time when December, she lifted a champagne flute to her lips, Marge stuck a little sponge in there between the cup and her lips and sucked it all out before December could get a single drop. And December raised an apricot to her lips, but Marge flicked it out before she could get to it. And December pulled a pomegranate and she peeled it apart in her on a plate, the juice dripping all over her hands. And Marge took that plate and whoops, flipped it before she could get a single bite. Now everyone else was gorging themselves on all these things, but December made it that whole night without drinking a single drop or eating a single bite. When the clock chimed, December got up and she was a little grumpy. She was kind of hungry and she nudged November and they got all the girls and they had to pull on January's arm and get her to go. And they all got back into those boats and rowed across the lake and went through the forest of diamond and of gold and of silver and up that staircase. And they all fell into bed, silent and still, except for December, who slept like this. She was very princess-like. Now the next morning, the servants came in to get everyone ready, and they trooped on down to breakfast. King sat there, the princesses sat there, Marge sat here, and the king said, well, Miss Margaret, it's your final morning, so I'll let you enjoy your breakfast and meet you in the throne room afterwards to hear your final answer. Well, that breakfast, 11 princesses sat still and quiet in front of 11 empty plates, but one princess grabbed bacon by the fistful and 3 pieces at a time. You're so good. And there's orange juice. And flapjacks. She was rolling the flapjacks and dipping them right in the jugs of maple syrup. December was feasting on this breakfast. Now, Cook, who'd been standing in the corner for all of these breakfasts, just sort of wringing her hands, almost cried to see December eating this way. Well, after breakfast, they all trooped into the throne room. The king sat in his throne. 12 princesses lined up in front of him. Marge, with all of her stuff she had packed up again because she might be kicked out, and William on a rope next to Marge. And the king said, Miss Margaret, do you have a solution for us on this final third morning? And Marge stepped forward. She was holding her bag in one hand and William in the other. And she said, well, Your Majesty, I might. But first, I think you need to hear from your youngest daughter. And December, standing next to Marge, said, but me? Me? And she looked at all of her sisters, and they were just looking straight ahead. She stepped forward and said, well, Daddy, okay, so what I remember is last night, we all went to bed like usual, but then the clock chimed, and November got me out of bed, and she made me get all dressed up and put on my dancing slippers, and then, no, this is crazy. This is crazy, isn't it? It must have been a dream, but Father, I tell you, January's bed, it sunk into the ground. And there was a staircase. It sounds crazy, I know, but there was a staircase, right? But they just looked straight ahead. There was a staircase, and then there was a forest, but it was like there was a silver one, and then there was a gold one, there was a diamond one, there was a big lake, there was like a mirror, and there were these very handsome, very genteel princes waiting for us, and there was a ball, Daddy, there was a ball like no ball I have ever seen before. The lights were twinkling, and everyone was dancing, and everyone was so handsome, and the ladies were so beautiful, and there was food, Daddy, there was food, and we went, after we danced, we went, and we sat down at the, we sat down at the tables, and then I woke up in my bed. So it must have been a dream, right? But it felt so real. And my feet have so many blisters. And the king said, I don't have time for this young girl's fancies. This is preposterous. Marge, Miss Margaret, what have you got for me? She stood forward and she said, Your Majesty, I know it sounds unbelievable, but December is telling the truth and I have proof. And she reached into her pocket and she pulled out a twinkling branch of diamond. And she reached into her other pocket and she pulled out some leaves of gold. And then she looked down at William. William, spit that out now. And there was a very wet clump of silver. And she said, well, Your Majesty, that was a silver flower. You see, there were those forests, and there was a dance, and there was food that sated without nourishing. Your Majesty, I'm afraid you were trying to protect your daughters, but in doing so, you have trapped them in with the one thing that was doing them so much harm. And the king said, preposterous. I don't believe it. We've got to test it. And they did. They sent all of the girls to a different bedroom that night. They locked them in with their new dancing slippers. And when they woke up in the morning, those dancing slippers were still new. And went to breakfast. King, princesses, Marge, and the princesses. Well, Cook was thrilled because Cook had to make breakfast 3 times. They ate so much. Fistfuls of bacon and piles of flapjacks. And January was like, shoving a scone into her mouth, and she was pulling out flapjacks to pile on her plate. And she said, Marge, would you pass me the syrup, please? And Marge almost cried as hard as Cook did to hear that. Well, the king, he looked at Marge and he said, Miss Margaret, it seems you were right. Well, which one of my daughters do you want to marry? And Marge said, oh, Your Majesty, these girls are like daughters to me. I don't want to marry any of them. And he said, well, then what boon would you ask of me in my kingdom? You've saved my daughter's life. And Marge said, well, Your Majesty, these years that I spent raising your daughters were the happiest years of my life. And if I could have one thing, it would simply be to live here again, with your permission and theirs. And the girls looked at Marge, and they all smiled and nodded. And the king said, well, is that all? You can ask literally anything. That seems really simple. And Marge thought about it, and she said, well, I'd really like to have a place for William, too. Could William live here, too? And they did. And they all lived happily ever after.